So, good morning, everybody. We will continue on this lecture related to chapter 1, an introduction to demography. And I stopped on these slides related to ratios, rates, and probabilities. So I'm taking advantage of this first chapter and adding some things to clarify to you some basic concepts in demography and in data analysis in general, right? So I explain what microdata are, variables, observations, independent, dependent variables, and now explaining the differences between ratios, rates, and probabilities. The idea is that you understand these terms, so whenever you are reading even the name of the indicator that you are analyzing, you have an idea of how it was estimated, right? So as I was talking in the previous class, ratios, it's when I'm comparing one subgroup of the population to the other subgroup of the population. I'm comparing the size of one subgroup of the population to the size of the other subgroup, right? So I can divide my population in two or more groups and then divide one by the other. A really clear case, as I mentioned, is the sex ratio, dividing men by women to know how many men we have more or less in a specific population than women in a specific year. Rates is when we get a specific population and we want to know if they experienced a specific event that we are measuring, right? So if I have total fertility rate, it comes from a series of sub-rates by age group, as we're going to see in the fertility chapter. But the idea is that I get number of women between 15 and 49 years of age in a specific country in a specific year. And then from them, I get which of these women had a live birth in the previous year. And I put that number in the numerator, right? So in the rates, I'm getting the population of interest in the denominator that is at risk or has a chance to experience the event that's being measured in the numerator. So mortality rate, I get the population in the denominator, and I get those from this population at the beginning of the period, for example, who died, or in the middle of the period, who died throughout that year. So I get the population in the US, for example, in July 2020, and I divide and put that in the denominator. In the numerator, I get all the people who died in the US in that year, in 2020. So the people in the denominator have the chance of experiencing the event that's being measured in the numerator, in this case, mortality. Migration rate, homicide rates, unemployment rate, all these indicators. Whenever you're talking about rate, we get the population denominator and measure which of them experienced that event that we are trying to understand. For example, unemployment rate out of the total population, how many of those people who are still looking for jobs don't have jobs? Unemployed people, and divide by the total population. And the rates, because these numbers can get really small, we usually multiply them by 100, so we analyze it in percentage terms, or we can also multiply by 1,000 or even by 100,000 for homicide rates, for example. And the rates, the idea, the denominator, we try to get the average population in that specific time point that was at risk or had the chance to experience the event be measured in the numerator. So usually the rate, an approximation for the denominator, is pretty much just getting the population in the middle of the period, because the population in the middle of the period kind of gives us an average of the population, for example, between January and December 2020. The probability is a little bit different than the rate because the denominator gets the population at the beginning of the period, divides the number of events by the total number of people at risk in the relevant time frame. So in that case, if I'm trying to say the mortality probability for a specific population, I get the population in January in that specific country, in specific year, and then put that in my denominator, and then in the numerator is the same one as the rate, the number of people who died in that specific year. So the difference, a simple way to differentiate between rates and probabilities is that the rate, I try to get the average population that's at risk or has the chance to experience the event in the numerator. So I usually get the population in the middle of the period in my denominator. Probability, I get the population at the beginning of the period, right? So rate has always this time concept. I want to know throughout that time how many people were exposed to experience this event. And I want to know people from January through December. Since it's really hard to get information about population each month of the year, we just get an average. Probability, we are actually not taking into account time. I just want to know the population at the beginning of the period that was exposed to that risk, right? So just give you some examples of ratios and rates. Ratios, like I said, describe the relationship between two numbers. Compare the size of one group to the size of another group. Compare the relative sizes of categories. Indicate how many times the first number contains the second. The denominator is not at risk of moving to the numerator. The denominator does not comprise the people who have a chance of experience the event that's being measured in the numerator. We also can multiply by 100 to analyze the indicator, the ratios in percentage terms. Like I said, the sex ratio, we divide the population of males by the population of females in a specific country, in a specific state, in a specific county, in a specific city from a given year. I have the sex ratio. The total dependency ratio, we divide the population in three groups by age groups. We get the population of children, those between 0 and 14, the elderly population, those with at least 65 years of age, and the working age population, those between 15 and 64. And see, I have here children and older people. In a specific year, in a specific country, I'm either a child or I'm either, or in a working age population, or even also I'm older. I cannot be the 3 or 2 at the same time. So I'm comparing these three different groups. What's the rationale about the sex ratio? I want to know if my population is evenly divided by sex, and that's a kind of a summary related to mortality and fertility. Maybe some countries, they have preference for sons, then the sex ratio tends to be high. Countries that don't have that, and we know that women live longer on average, the sex ratio might be declining in these last decades because women live longer, so we have more women. And the total dependency ratio, it's really important for policymakers because if we see that we have a larger group of people comprised by children and elderly people who are my dependent population, right? Dependent population, because they depend on the production from the working age population. If I have too many children and older people rely on the work, on the production of working age population, I might encounter some pressure in my economy, in my society. I will have to build more schools and have a better retirement system with a small number of working age population, proportionally speaking, right? And we can calculate those numbers for several countries across over time. And this is one example. Getting sex ratios, the sex ratio overall, getting the number of men divided by the number of women in these specific groups of countries here, more developed regions in green, less developed regions in orange, and United States and China by themselves. And in this case, getting data from the UN from 1950 to 2015. So what do you see? That in more developed regions, you have a sex ratio below 100%. So just go back to the formula. I got this population of males divided by population of females multiplied by 100. If this number is above 100, I have more men than women. Below 100, I have more women than men. So what I see here, that in more developed regions, I have more women than men, right? But this differential has been declining over time. So the sex ratio increases, gets closer to 100%. So it means that the number of women is, compared to men, is getting closer to the overall number of men that we have in the population. And that might be because now men are also experiencing improvements in mortality, so they die at older ages, and that improvement is increasing faster than women. And women still live longer than men. It's still sex ratio overall is below 100% for more developed regions. And then when you see in less developed regions, you see exactly the opposite. You have more men than women, and kind of like stable over time, kind of declining a little bit. So you start to increase the number of women proportional to men. In that case, is because a lot of these less developed regions have preferences for sons. So when a woman realizes that she's pregnant of a daughter, there are countries that they perform an abortion when they see that in an ultrasound because there is preference for sons. And that generates, then we have more boys being born than girls. And in those countries, still overall, women live longer than men. But in some countries, women don't have so much access to even food when they are living with their parents as children. They don't have access to education, and that they will not have access to good jobs. And all that affects their health. All that affects their mortality later on. So maybe the advantage of women in terms of life expectancy is not that much higher than the life expectancy of men, right? Because of all this gender inequality that they experience in some of these countries. Less resources when they're children within the household. If a household is poor, don't have food for everybody, it's common in some countries to give more resources to boys, more food to boys instead of to girls. And then girls don't go to school, and then they don't get good jobs and rely on their husbands in those specific countries, and their health and mortality deteriorate, right? And then if you see the US and China, the US actually have sex ratios closer to 100 when you compare the overall group of more developed regions. So in the US back in 1950, pretty much you have really similar numbers of women and men in the country, and you experience improvements in life expectancy for women. So more women in the country, sex ratios decline. And then in more recent years, you start to see improvements in life expectancy of men, more improvement on life expectancy of men compared to women, and that creates an increase on sex ratio. Then you start to have more men, right? And in China, the sex ratios are even higher than for the overall less developed regions, right? China had the one-child policy. Even with the one-child policy, on average, women had 2 children, right? The total fertility rate, even during the one-child policy between 1979 and 2013, it was around two children per woman. But because of this policy from the government, and also because economic development in China, it starts to be more expensive to have more children, women start to want to have less children, or families in general want to have less children. And in their culture, there is a preference for sons. Ultrasound allow us to know the sex of the baby, and then they perform an abortion. That generates a huge increase in sex ratios. And here it's around 108, the maximum in 1950. But in some examples that I'm going to show throughout the semester, in some cases they can reach even around 120 in specific countries. Overall, the sex ratios should be around 105. We usually say that the biological average of sex ratios should be around 105. Still, we have more men being born biologically. There are more baby boys being born than girls. And then that number should be around 105. If it's too different than that, there is something going on. In this case here, preference for sons, less resources to daughters. And in this case here, since we are talking about sex ratios for the whole population, not just sex ratio at birth, there is the mortality effect. Women live longer, then you have less men in the population. The 105 would be the biological normal for the sex ratio at birth. 105 births of men, you should expect 100 births of women, right? Boys and girls. But as they get older, boys die faster, the sex ratio declines, okay? Really simple indicator, just a ratio divided the number of men by women in a population over time for specific subgroups of the population. We can do a long analysis about it, right? And talk about cultural preferences and talk about economic development and policies and so on. Another example, the total dependency ratios for India, China, and the US. We get the number of children and the number of older people, add them, put in the numerator, and divide by the working age population. And we get these trends here for India, China, and the US between 1950 and 2050. Of course, 2050, because we are relying on the projections from the United Nations. So for the US, 1950, you start to see an increase in the total dependency ratio because still fertility is high. As fertility is high, the number of children increase in the numerator relative to the working age population. So total dependency ratio increases. As fertility declines, these children proportionally start to be a smaller number in my ratio, and they start to go to my denominator and nobody's replacing them, the total dependency ratio starts to decline and reach these lowest levels here for the US. And now it starts to increase again and start to increase until around 2030 when we tended to stabilize after that. Why start to increase again? Remember, we have the formula there, right? So we have fewer children because fertility is declining. So in the short term, in the short term, the total dependency ratio declines because you have fewer children here proportionally. And then with fewer children, you're going to have more working age population proportionally. And as time goes on, still with low fertility, these people here start to get older and go to the numerator. And that will increase the total dependency ratios. We can break down the total dependency ratio by the youth dependency ratio and the old age dependency ratio. The youth dependency ratio, we put just children in the numerator. The old age, only older people in the numerator. And I'm going to show you also throughout the semester some examples. But here's just to show how this, an example of a ratio and how it tells us a story about the US. In China, the light blue line here also experienced a decline in fertility, fewer children proportion, total dependency ratio declines. And then now population getting older for these next decades, we expect more older people in the population proportionally to the working age, total dependency ratio increases, okay? And India is a little bit behind in this demographic transition, already experiencing a decline in fertility. So you see the total dependency ratio declines related to fewer children, but still you don't have a proportional increase in the number of older people in the country related to the working age population. So still, the total dependency ratio did not actually increase as much as we saw for China and the US, okay? Really simple indicator, total dependency ratio. You get 3 countries over time. All this data is available for free. You can just go to the United Nations Population Division website and get it for specific countries. You can choose the countries and so on. And you can analyze what's going on, what's behind those changes. Rates. And the explanation of rates here, I make reference to this other article that kind of goes in detail about the differences between rates and probabilities. Rates are instantaneous measures that range from 0 to infinity. Rates describe the number of occurrences of an event for a given number of individuals per unit of time. Rates consider the time spent at risk. The numerator includes the number of events. When you're talking about demography, we usually focus on migration, fertility, mortality rates, but it can be other things. It can, I just mentioned before, unemployment rates, homicide rates, and so on. And that's the numerator, the number of events that we are measuring that people are experiencing. The denominator includes time, the sum of each individual's time at risk of experiencing an event for a specific population during a specific time period, and that is called person years. So let me just spend some time here. Let's say that I'm alive in January 2022, and I'm alive in February until the end of February 2022, and then I die in February 28th this year. So I lived 2 years in 2022. And sorry, I lived 2 months in 2022. And I will not live, I will not experience the rest of the year because I'm dead. If I'm trying to estimate mortality rates for this population, the most appropriate way to measure it, in my case, would be I experienced death, right? In this example. So I would enter in the numerator. I will count 1 in the numerator. In the denominator, I will count 2 divided by 12. So I will count as 2 months out of 12 months. That's the time that I was exposed to the risk of dying. I was exposed to the risk of dying only for 2 months and then I die, right? So it's 2 divided by 12 in the denominator. And then I get everybody here. Everybody here is alive in January 2022 and is going to be alive at least until December 31st, 2022. Everybody will live the whole year. Nobody is going to be counting the numerator. Nobody enters the numerator. And everybody, of course, will enter the denominator. But in the denominator, you enter as 12 divided by 12. You enter as 1 unit for each one of you, right? I will enter only 2 twelfths, right? Because I die in February. That's really difficult to measure that, right? Because I have to know the information of people alive in each one of the months between January 2022 and December 2022 for everybody in my population. So it's difficult to measure that. Because it's difficult to measure that, to measure what? The person years, or how many years I was exposed to the chance of experiencing death. I was 2 twelfths. you owe all 1 full year, 2 12s. That's person years. That's difficult to have data to measure person years. So usually demographers, they make an approximation. What is the approximation? They can get the population in the middle of the period, usually around July, to say that's the population, the average population that's at risk of experiencing the event that I measured in the numerator. What's my assumption there? I'm talking about mortality. The assumption there is that before July, between January and July, and between July and December, the chances of dying, the mortality rates, that's my subject here, it's pretty much similar. There is no more higher or lower chances of dying in the first or second semester of the year. So this approximation of the population in the middle of the year is a good approximation. If for some reason there is much higher mortality in the spring compared to the fall or vice versa, then my assumption is not so good, right? But if the levels of mortality are pretty much the same in the spring and in the fall, then the population in the middle of the period is a good approximation for my denominator. Or another way to approximate it, let's say that I have the population in January and the population in December. Add both of them, divide by 2, I get also a good approximation to my person years, to the number of years that people were exposed to the risk of dying in that example. So rates, technically, the denominator should be person years. We usually don't have that much refined data, so we use these approximations. They're usually the first one, the population in the middle of the period. Some really simple examples here. The crude birth rate and the death birth rate. Express the number of actual occurrences of an event, in this case, number of births and number of deaths, versus the number of possible occurrences per specific unit of time. How many, with the idea that the crude birth rate here would be that it's not a really good, the crude death rate is better. Out of the whole population, technically, everybody can die in a specific year, in a specific unit of time, and then they can experience death. So my crude death rate here technically can be equals to 1,000, multiplying by 1,000 here, just because usually this number here is really small, but let's not multiply it. Technically, if I have a whole population die in a specific year, I have a crude death rate equals to 1. The crude birth rate is a little bit more difficult because we even will discuss more about it. We usually use fertility rate. The fertility rate put in the denominator only population of women. The birth rate puts in the denominator the population of men and women together. Birth rate, denominator, man and woman. Fertility rate, denominator, only women. Reproduction rate, denominator, only women. And numerator, only births of girls. So that's the difference between birth rates, fertility rates, and reproduction rates that we're going to discuss more in detail also throughout the semester. But here I just want to show you really simple examples of rates. Let's see some trends of crude birth rates and death rates for the US between 1950 and the projections by the UN until 2100. And we see that fertility declined a lot around the 60s and 70s and declined even more in more recent decades, but it's kind of like stable around 12 births per 1,000 people. So for every 1,000 people nowadays, you have around, for 1,000 people in the US nowadays, you have around 12 births being measured, right? Being happening in the society, in the country. The crude death rates, we see that it oscillates between 8 per 1,000 and a little like, let's say, 11.5 per 1,000. It increased a little bit in this last, it's expected to increase a little bit in the next decades, exactly because we have an older population. As we have an older population, more people will die. They reach older ages. So overall, around 10 people die in the US for every 1,000 people alive in the middle of the period. In the middle of the period, because I'm talking about rates, in the denominator is the population in the middle of the period, right? So we are around, so actually we are around here. Yeah, so actually we are 8.5, not 10. So 8.5 deaths for every 1,000 people in the US per year, right? And probabilities describe the likelihood that an event will occur for a single individual in a given time, and it ranges from 0 to 1. It does not include time in the denominator. So I don't care about person years. I don't care about that exposure that we had in the rates. It divides the number of events by the total number of people at risk in the relevant time frame. There is a formula that we can, and this paper shows the formula that we can just calculate it. If you have the rate, you can calculate the probability and vice versa. But that formula is not important here for us. It's more important to understand the concepts, and we will see a formula of translating rates into probabilities in the life tables in the chapter about mortality. And as a way to simplify the notion of probability, just imagine the denominator, since it does not include time, the denominator, let's say for that mortality rate that I told you guys here, instead of getting the population in the middle of the period, I just get the population in January of that year, in January 2022, in that example that I started to talk about when I was explaining person years. So the probability, the denominator would be the population in January 2022. The numerator would be the same thing, people who died between January and December 2022. The numerator in probabilities and rates is similar. The denominator is a different thing, right? So probabilities out of this population that starts at the beginning of the period, how many of them experience the event? The rate is the population in the middle of the period, right? Has to do with exposure through that period of time. And this paper is this one here. You can access it, just Google it, you can download it. It's more technical. I tried to bring here to the classroom just the most important concepts related to our class, so you understand when I tell you about maternal mortality ratio. When I tell you the maternal mortality ratio, you understand that I don't have in the denominator a group that experiences the event that's being measured in the numerator. What is maternal mortality ratio? It's number of women who died due to problems in pregnancy or birth divided by the number of live births in that specific country, in that specific year. Live births, a baby is being born. The numerator, women dying due to problems of birth and pregnancy. So it's not a population that I measure in the denominator that has a chance of experiencing the event being measured in the numerator. Are two different groups, women and babies. That's why it's called ratio, maternal mortality ratio, right? So this is the lecture about chapter 1. Now we start on the chapter about age and sex composition. We will jump to chapter 10. If you just go to the course website, I already uploaded here the lecture related to chapter 10, age and sex composition. I uploaded it today. And there is this video here by the Population Reference Bureau. Population Reference Bureau is a research center that collects information, demographic data from several countries, and they have their own research projects, and they have really good resources. And this other link here, it's a compressed zipped file in which I just compress a series of Excel files in which I show how to make some graphs in Excel. I mean, that might be really basic for you here, but if you uncompress it, you're gonna get these subfolders here. The most important one that I'm gonna show to you after I pass through the lecture is this age sex structure, and I use data from Brazil just to show how you can create your own age sex structures or the age sex pyramids for whatever population you have data for. So you just need the population, the male population by age group, the female population by age group for a specific year, and then you can generate the age sex structure for that specific country in that specific year. In this case here, I have 4 years, 70, 80, 91, and 2000. And also here I have the dependency ratio. In this case, see, I broke it down. The light blue is the old age dependency ratio. Sorry, the light blue is the child dependency ratio, has been declining over time because fertility declines. We have fewer children in relation to the working age population in Brazil. And as population get older, the dark blue here is the old age dependency ratio. More people with at least 65 years of age, the old age dependency ratio increases, right? So that's the similar graph as the one that I showed for China, India, and the US, but in this case, broken down by old age dependency ratio and youth dependency ratio. And there are other, just some other files here showing somehow just generating really simple graphs. You can get a specific data from the United Nations Population Division, or if you can get it even from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, you can get the data here, and then you can generate your own graphs. And here's just an example of how you can do that really easily, right? I did not calculate these numbers here. These were all data that I got, for example, from the United Nations, okay? Cool. So the material, this material is all here. The video, the extra video that if you want to watch is also available in the course website. And the lecture that I'm going to start now, you can download it. And remember, if you click here and it doesn't open, if it says the file is not there, just press Shift on your keyboard and refresh the browser and it's going to open, okay? Let's start here now. Printer. So this lecture is all based on chapter 10, but as you're going to see, I added things that from other sources as well throughout these slides. So that's why you should read both the textbook and these slides. Give an introduction about age, sex structure, the concepts of age and sex, some theoretical issues, give examples of population pyramids. Usually nowadays, we don't call them as much as pyramid because now since we have more older people, the shape of the age sex structure is becoming more rectangular. So we usually call it age sex structure or age sex distribution of a population. We're going to talk about age dependency, exactly the same thing as I said now before, dependency dependency ratios that I showed now, the youth dependency ratio, the old age dependency ratio, and the total dependency ratio, pretty much comparing the size of children and older people in relation to working age people. Talk about age heaping. Age heaping is an issue that you have with collection of data about age. In some countries, when you ask people about their ages, and you are collecting information for a research project, some people might just round up their ages or round down. Instead of like saying that they are 27, they could say that they are 25, or instead of saying that they are 29, they say they are 30. And there is this technique in demography to see if there is some preferences for specific digits, people rounding up or down their ages. Sex structure, kind of discussing again the number of men in relation to the number of women in a population. Sex ratio at birth, going a little bit more in depth about how that, to show you that some countries experience more births of sons than daughters, much more than expected. And talk about this discussion about like the fertility has been declining in these last decades, and there is improvement in health services and nutrition and so on. People live longer, and then a higher proportion of people are reaching older ages. There is this process of population aging, right? And developed countries have been experiencing that for already several decades, and the least developed countries are starting to experience that as well, right? So age and sex are the most important and relevant characteristics of populations for demographers. Tell us about the structure of the population. And these are known as the demographic characteristics. So usually when you hear someone say, oh, what's the demographics of that specific group? Usually people are emphasizing what's the age distribution, what's the sex distribution of that population. But you can even provide more information if you go more in depth on the three demographic processes: fertility, mortality, and migration. You can say that, okay, the age sex structure for population right now, it had more a pyramid shape, and now it's becoming more rectangular. And that's due to the fact that you have a decline in fertility, people living longer. So you have fewer children at the base of the pyramid and more people in older ages. So what you're pretty much saying is that the age and sex distribution of a population is associated with changes in fertility, mortality, and migration. Fertility, as people have fewer children, the base of the age-sex structure becomes smaller proportionally. As people live longer, the top of the age-sex structure becomes wider proportionally. And if you have a country that has high levels of immigration, usually immigrants, they are usually constant. You have higher chances of having immigrants between the ages of around 20 and 35. If you have a country with a lot of immigrants, those groups between 20 and 35 or 20 and 40 will proportionally have more people. And if you have the other way around, a country that has a lot of immigration, a lot of people live in those countries, you might see a dip in between the ages of 20 and 40. That's where people migrate more. And if you have fewer people there, you're going to have that you can observe on your age sex structure of that population. But this is just to say that the age and sex distribution, the age and sex structure of a population specific here, is the result of changes in trends and levels of fertility and mortality and migration that population experienced in these last years, right? These components produce the population's age and sex structure, which in turn influence the demographic processes. There is reverse causality, right? Fertility declines, fewer children in the base of the pyramid. People living longer, more people in the top. You have a lot of immigration, you might see this. You have a lot of emigration, you might see the opposite. And once you have a decline in fertility, for example, this smaller group of people, of children, will get older. And when they reach reproductive ages between 15 and 49, even if the levels of fertility remain the same, the number of children will not, the number of children will also remain the same because you have a smaller cohort size of these children get older. But if they have a little bit of a decline in fertility, the number of children will even decline even more, right? So what I'm saying is that if you have fertility decline in a population, it changes the age-sex structure of that population. And then the age-sex structure itself afterwards will affect the trends in fertility, right? Because then you have fewer children or fewer people in reproductive ages, and then you're going to have fewer chances of having children. And so fertility, mortality, migration affect age-sex structure, and age-sex structure affect fertility, mortality, and migration, okay? So because of that, we're not talking about causality. Again, something that I said in the preview, like last week. We are trying to understand the trends of demographic indicators, the levels of demographic indicators. What are the associated factors? I'm not necessarily looking for causality, okay? And just talking about the concepts of age and sex, as is discussed in the textbook. Age is an ascribed and changeable characteristic. In population censuses, it is usually defined in terms of the age of a person at his or her last birthday. The United Nations definition, age is estimated or calculated interval of time between the date of birth and the date of the census, expressed in complete solar years. So really specific concept to make it really clear how age is estimated. Sex is an ascribed characteristic, and for most people unchangeable throughout their lives. For most people, sex is fixed at birth, but there are some who do change their sex. I understand about the complexity about sex, and usually historical demographic data and even more recent demographic data, we divide the population between men and women, right? And if you have a specific survey that you can collect your own data, you can ask that the question about sex in a more flexible style, not just between men and women. But here I should say that age changes as people get older, of course, and sex usually doesn't change, right? And we just want to know the distribution, the structure of the population by age and sex. Sex, for the most part, not always, is an ascribed variable whose designation is based on biology. And then it comes a little bit this discussion between sex and gender. Sex is this characteristic based more on biology, and gender, the idea is that I want to know if there are differences between men and women related to non-biological factors, right? Are mortality rates different by sex? Women live longer than men. Migration rates are higher for men than women. For some countries might be the case, from others might not be the case. Crime rates are higher for men than women. Yes, usually it is. And so on. I want to understand a specific indicator of migration, marriage, divorce, labor force participation, and how these trends vary by sex. I want to know if in a specific country, proportionally more men are working or participating in the labor force compared to women. Why is that happening? When I bring into my analysis this sociological, political, ideological, economic aspects of my society that make some indicators vary by sex, I'm bringing non-biological differences. And I'm dividing I'm calculating this for men and for women. In that case, I'm doing a gender analysis, right? I'm trying to understand how specific socioeconomic, demographic indicators vary by sex, because I want to understand how my society gives different opportunities and make those indicators have different trends and levels by sex, right? Usually demographers tend to use the term sex even when they are discussing non-biological differences between men and women. So even sometimes here in the textbook, or I will be talking mortality rates by sex, migration rates by sex, and so on. That's how usually demographers use the term, but technically, I'm trying to understand gender differences that make a specific group have higher levels of mortality, higher levels of migration, higher levels of political leaning towards specific political party, or higher levels of crime and so on, right? But just to emphasize that even demographers, when we are talking about non-biological differences between men and women, we usually use the term sex, although it should be gender, okay? And here I'm just going to give you some examples to show you the general trends of fertility, mortality, migration, how they vary by sex and age. So fertility, what's the difference between fertility and fecundity? Fertility is the actual production of children, how many children women had. Fecundity is the ability to produce children. As a woman or a man, do they have the biological characteristics to be able to produce children, or they're infertile, right? Who knows any Latin language here, such as Spanish? The terms are exactly the opposite. Fertility in English is fecundidad in Spanish. In fecundity in English is fertilidad in Spanish. So if you're reading a Latin language, you might see these concepts in the other way around. But fertility, I'm counting how many children my population had in a specific time point. Fecundity is the ability, the biological ability of people having children throughout their lives. In fertility and fecundity, they vary by sex, right? As we talked before, the actual number of children being born, the actual production of children, we usually have more baby boys than baby girls, even if there is no preference for sons, right? The normal sex ratio at birth is around 105 boys being born for every 100 girls being born, right? There's like a lot of debate, like both from biologists and demographers, of why that happens. There is this line of study that's called the fragile male hypothesis, that baby boys are weaker than baby girls. They need more resources to survive at the beginning of their life. So in some way, biology adapted to that. And then we have more boys being born because they're going to die with a higher chance than girls. And then afterwards, that number tends to stabilize throughout their lives. So that's called the fragile male hypothesis, that boys need more resources, food, right, to survive their first months and years of life. And there's also this discussion about usually when you have a baby boy or a baby girl, the specific place where the embryo tends to be more like a male, the embryo tends to be male or female, it varies throughout the reproductive period of the woman. And usually the male embryos tend to be weaker than the female ones, right? So there's a lot of discussion about that, but here for demographers, the idea is that fertility varies by sex. I'm not talking about men or women having more children. What I'm talking here is that we have more boys being born than girls overall, right? If there is no intervention. Some countries, there is preference for sons, and then you see more sons, even more than 105 boys than we see here, 105 for every 100 girls. We can reach 120 boys for every 100 girls. But overall, biological normal, sex ratio at birth, 105 boys for every 100 girls. In fecundity, the age in which women and men are able to produce children also varies. Usually, the higher chances of having children among women is between the ages of 15 and 49. And of course, closer to 15 and closer to 49 are lower than in more middle ages in that age range. And for males, fecundity is a little wider in terms of age, can usually around 15 and 79, right? So it's just to show that fertility varies by sex and fecundity varies by sex and also varies by age. I just talked here. Women, usually we calculate fertility rates for women between the ages of 15 and 49. And that's an example here. We have fertility rates for each one of the subgroups of women. For this specific case, between 2015 and 2020, the black line, for this specific group of women here, we counted how many of them were between 15 and 19. And between those years, how many children did they have? Divide this number of children by the number of women. We have the fertility rate for this specific subgroup of women in that specific time period. And do the same for older women, and we see that it increases up to 34 years of age, and then it starts to decline again. Right? So fertility varies by age. And in this case, age-specific fertility rates, we are getting information only for women having children. And we expect for the next decades that women will keep postponing the age in which they have children, right? Now women are investing in their education, investing in getting a career before getting married, before having children. Or even if they get married, they postpone the age in which they have children until they're more stabilized. And that's shown by the gray curve here. You start to see that younger women are expected to have fewer children in the next decades than now. And women between 30 to 34 are be the ones experience the highest numbers. And the ones in older ages will tend to have similar levels as now, which are already lower levels than we see between 30 to 34. That's a major subject in demography, this postponement in fertility, women postponing the ages in which they have children. They postpone the age in which they have children. Let's say that the previous generation tends to have children, the highest rates were around 25 and 34. But now their daughters will postpone. They will tend to have children more between the ages of 30 and 34. So in the short term, you might see a decline in fertility because this woman here now on average will have children older than what their mothers had. So you might see a decline in fertility. But as they reach the age in which they want to have children, they will start to have children, maybe fertility will increase again. But if they postpone too much and then they don't catch up to the number of children that they would like to have, then fertility will continue to be in a lower level. The postponement in fertility usually creates a short-term decline in fertility. As women reach the age in which they want to have children, fertility increases again. If they postpone too much, they might not have enough time to have those children that they would like to have, and then fertility remains at lower levels. Right? That analysis of postponement in fertility talks about this period and tempo changes in fertility. Period, the short-term declines in fertility, you might see that afterwards there is the tempo effect, there is the time effect, the postponement. As women reach their older ages in which they want to have children, fertility might go up. So you see that really simple variations of the first demographic component that I'm talking here, the first one that I'm talking about, variation by age, you have all these studies trying to understand these changes over time, not just between age groups, but also over time. Mortality varies by sex. Females have lower death rates than males at every age of life. This differential has been observed throughout the centuries and may be attributed to both behavior and genetic causes. Women are stronger, and women also have better behavior in society that are less exposed to risks of dying. Males are more prone than females to engage in health and life risk-taking behaviors, such as cigarette smoking, for example. Estrogen protects women from heart and blood vessels. Protects the heart and blood vessels. Testosterone for men works in the opposite way. Tends to promote higher blood pressure, suppress the effectiveness of the immune system, increase thrombosis. So there is biological reasons why women tend to live longer than men, or healthier than men. And also sociological, behavioral reasons as well. And mortality also varies by age. Death rates are high in the first year of life and then drop to very low levels. The first years of life, or the first year of life before the child reaches 1 year of age, the chances of dying are really high. Once the child reaches 1 year of life, the chances of dying drops a lot. In modern population, the death rates do not reach the levels of the first year until for another 50, 60 years. And cause-specific mortality is often age-related. So younger people are more likely to die because of external causes, accidents, violence-related causes. And older people are more likely to die because of degenerative diseases. Younger people are more likely to die because of infectious diseases or genetical problems, right? The genetical problems are more persistent in the first months of life, but infectious, communicable diseases affect children a lot. And also the older population, as we are seeing throughout this pandemic, right? And this is an example of how mortality varies by age. So we have mortality rates for each one of the subgroups here. We count how many people are in that subgroup in the denominator, in the middle of the period. In the numerator, we count how many people died in that specific year in each one of those countries, right? Mortality rates for each age group, age-specific mortality rates. And you see that usually for mortality rates, the first age group that would be between 0 and 4, we subdivided between those that did not complete 1 year of age and those that are between 1 and 4 years of age. Because these ones here are much more likely to die than these ones here. Children who did not reach yet 1 year of age are more likely to die, and usually related to genetic causes, as I said, biological causes, but also because they are more susceptible to die because of diseases in their first year of life, even diseases contracted from the environment, right? So you see all the countries, Japan, Guatemala, and Nigeria having really high levels of mortality rates. The mortality rate for this first age group for children, how many children did not survive, did die before they reach age 1? How many children died before they reach age 1? Numerator, how many children were born in that country in that specific year? That's this first one here. This first age-specific mortality rate is also called the infant mortality rate. That's the infant mortality rate, right? So the infant mortality rate is really high. And even in Japan, it's high. And then after the kids reach age 1, the chance of dying decline a lot. And as people get older, they get exposed to other diseases in younger ages because of more external causes, violence, bad habits, and so on. And then degenerative diseases. Guatemala has higher levels than Japan. Of course, the data here is old, but what I'm trying to show is more variation by age. And we can also see variation between the countries. Guatemala is higher, declines, and increases afterwards. The same pattern you also see for Nigeria. And what we said here before, death rates do not reach the level of the first year of life for another 50, 60 years. See Japan. Japan is going to reach these levels here just around the ages of 50 to 54. Guatemala, around the ages of 65. Nigeria, around the age of 75, right? So the high levels of mortality that we experience, the chances of dying that we experience when we are babies, we will experience that again only when we reach older ages, right? Just an example of how mortality rates vary by age. And migration also varies by sex and age. Especially in developing countries, sex is related to distance of migration. Usually in developing countries, if you see there is a lot of long distance migration from really far away areas within a country or between countries, usually men tend to migrate more than women. And short distance migration, maybe between a rural and an urban area, they are closer, you usually have higher chances of women migrating short distances. But that all can vary, and that's usually the specific case of developing countries. More developed countries, you have less differentiation of migration by sex. With increases in gender equity, migration of females and males tend to be similar. So that's the case of more developed countries. And migration also varies by age, is age selective. The largest numbers of migrants are found among young adults. And that's one example. Again, that's old data, but what we are trying to understand, here's the pattern. We see by age group, we have migration high for young kids, and then declines, increase in labor ages, and decline again. First thing, why we don't have age 0 here? Because the question that's asked in the American Community Survey to generate this kind of graphs, we ask, where did you live exactly 1 year ago? The babies who are below 1 year of age at the time of the interview, they were not alive 1 year ago. So that's why we don't have data for babies for 0 here. We just have data for those who are at least 1 year old, because then we know if they were in another place within the US or they were living in that same place right now. So here we are just showing inter-county migration, people migrating from one county to the other. And usually the pattern of migration, we see that these children here, these rates, they reflect the rates of their parents. These are the parents migrating with their children. And these ones here are people moving because of going to college, or after they finish college, they move to another place where they get jobs. And then the chances of migrating really increase a lot until they stabilize, get married, start to have children, their chances of migrating declines. And it keeps declining until older ages in which these people might migrate because they retire and then they prefer to move to another place, or they go to specific institutions to help with their care, right? But this, usually you have fewer people here, so these oscillations are not really similar across countries and over time. But these overall trends here are really interesting to understand. All of them are interesting to understand, but these ones here usually have the same pattern. But what you could see too is that if you have a specific country, like a developing country, where males migrate more than men migrate more than women, then what you might see is that the rates for men is high, even for the ones in ages of being parents, and the migration rates for children here might be low. And we're going to see that examples throughout the semester. Countries that have really low levels of migration of children and still high levels of migration of their parents. That's an indication that parents are moving, or at least men are moving without their children, leaving the family behind and moving to another place within the country to get better job opportunities, for example, right? Again, simple graphs of mortality, of migration rates by age gives us information about countries. And if we have that information over time, changes over time as well. Okay. Age and sex structure help us understand demographic history of population. Persons of the same age constitute a group or cohort who were born during the same period. We discussed cohort in the previous class. Therefore, they have been exposed to similar historical facts and conditions. These experiences also differ according to sex. So everything, income, home ownership, occupation, group membership are likely to vary by age and sex as well. So any analysis that you want to do to analyze our society is always good to do that analysis if you have the data by age and sex. Age and sex structure of human population sets important limits with respect to the sustenance organization. And here by Amos Hawley, the demographic structure of age and sex contains the possibilities and sets the limits of organized group life. China, for example, have many more men than women. So we start to see Chinese men looking for women in other countries, North Korea, for example. Or sometimes you see in the news, like some parks in China that you see men publicizing themselves with like some signs, say, oh, I have a car, I have a house, I'm well off, please marry me. So it's pretty much this creates this really marriage market related to how the sex structure is in that country, right? The degree to which a population's age and sex structure limits the kinds of sustenance activities is an important analytical issue, and it is still not well understood. That's why you still see demographers trying to understand variations in demographic indicators by age and sex, and also how age and sex structure affects other indicators in that society. There are different theories that try to understand variations of the demographic components by age and sex, such as marriage patterns by age, by Ainsley Cole, description of fertility patterns by age, in the absence of voluntary fertility control. There is a model by Andrew Rogers, who used to be a professor. He retired in University of Colorado Boulder, that he tried to understand how can we actually create a mathematical formula to better understand migration rates by age. So he created a mathematical formula trying to understand this variation, decline in younger ages, increase, and then decline again. And the stable population theory is maybe the most powerful mathematical theory in demography, because it helps us understand what's going to happen in the future. It incorporates a population age and sex structure, particularly age. And I'm going to discuss this more in the next class, but I mentioned to you some controversy that I had just now related to that. Was like Elon Musk just tweet, I think it was early last week, something about how to do a projection of the populations, just take life expectancy and multiply by number of births. And then the demographic community got really crazy about that. And it's really related to this discussion here that might appear really difficult to understand, but this theory is pretty much saying, How would our society be in the future if migration didn't happen? Let's say that fertility rates and mortality rates are constant. Of course, people are having children, are dying, but let's say that migration doesn't happen. And fertility and mortality have been more stable over time. If we have that case of a population, what are we going to have in the future is a population that will tend to stability in age and sex composition, will tend to be stable over time. And a stationary population is that in which the number of births and deaths is pretty much the same in the population, right? So Elon Musk just tweeted this. You can download this and look at a little, and I will go through this in the next class. But he pretty much was saying, oh, these UN projections that I just showed you in the previous slides are nonsense. There is something easier. Just multiply the life expectancy at birth by number of births. And demographers said, no, not so easy. It's not so easy to do it. And this guy here, he's an assistant professor at the University of Southern Denmark, Ilya Kashnitsky. He kind of did some exercises to show how off would be that exercise proposed by Elon Musk to the actual projection of populations observed throughout the years, right? And he did this exercise for several countries. You cannot read here, but if you download the slide, you can zoom in. And here I'm zooming into Russia, Taiwan, and USA to show how this simple multiplication that he did, it's not what I want you guys to learn here. You can be rich as much as you want, but never say something like that. And at the same time said that you took my class, right? You can say that, but never say that you took my class, right? Cool. So I'll discuss that in the next class. Have a great weekend and see you on Tuesday.